Welcome to History of Anything and Everything, the channel where we unravel the tangled threads of the past to understand the present. Today, we're diving into the tumultuous life of a king who defied expectations, embraced pragmatism, and ultimately reshaped the destiny of France, Henry IV. Imagine a nation tearing itself apart, not by external invasion, but from within. This was France in the late 16th century, a kingdom consumed by decades of brutal religious warfare. For over 30 years, the very fabric of French society had been shredded by a conflict that pitted neighbor against neighbor, family against family, all in the name of God. These were the French Wars of Religion, a series of 8 civil wars ignited by the Protestant Reformation. While Northern Europe saw its own religious upheavals, in France, the schism between Catholics and the growing Protestant minority, known as Huguenots, escalated into a bloodbath. It wasn't just theological debate, it was visceral hatred, culminating in horrors like the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, where thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and across France. This wasn't just a political struggle, it was an existential one for many. On one side stood the staunchly Catholic faction, largely led by the powerful and ambitious Guise family, often with the support of the Spanish Habsburgs and the papacy. They saw the Huguenots as heretics who threatened the spiritual purity and very soul of France. On the other, the Huguenots, a significant and increasingly influential minority, fighting for their right to worship freely, often allied with Protestant powers like England. Caught in the middle were the last Valois kings, weak and often manipulated, presiding over a kingdom descending into anarchy. The economy was shattered, trade routes disrupted, and the very concept of a unified France seemed to be crumbling. It's into this cauldron of chaos that our protagonist emerges, Henry of Navarre. Born in 1553, Henry was a Protestant prince from the small, independent kingdom of Navarre, nestled in the rugged Pyrenees Mountains. He was a distant cousin to the Valois kings, but a Protestant, which, at this time, made his path to the French throne seem utterly impossible. Yet, fate and a lot of untimely deaths had other plans. Henry was no cloistered royal. He was charismatic, intelligent, a skilled military leader, and famously, incredibly pragmatic. He understood people. He knew how to fight, and crucially, he knew how to survive. He had already survived the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre by feigning conversion, only to escape later and rejoin the Protestant cause. He was a survivor, forged in the crucible of war and political intrigue. And then, a series of astonishing events. The Valois line, one by one, withered and died out. First, Francis II, then Charles IX, and finally Henry III, assassinated in 1589 by a fanatical Catholic monk. Suddenly, the impossible became reality. Henry of Navarre, the Protestant leader, was, by the laws of succession, the rightful king of France. The Salic law, which forbade female succession, left him as the only legitimate male heir. But there was a monumental problem. France was overwhelmingly Catholic, and the powerful Catholic League, backed by Spain, refused to accept a Protestant king. For them, a heretic on the throne was an abomination, an insult to God. The very concept of France as the eldest daughter of the Church was at stake. For Henry, the crown of France was within reach. But so too was perpetual war, a war that could tear his nascent kingdom apart for good. The question wasn't just if he could rule, but how he could rule a kingdom so utterly fractured by faith. He needed to make a choice, one that would define his reign and reshape the destiny of France forever. Henry had the legitimate claim, and he was a formidable warrior. He had already proven his military prowess in battles like Coutras and Ivry, where he famously declared, "Rally to my white plume. You will find it on the path to honor and glory." He defeated the Catholic League's forces in the field. But despite these victories, he couldn't conquer Paris. The city, a staunch Catholic stronghold, was fiercely defended, often with Spanish help. And even if he took it by force, how could he govern a populace that viewed him as an illegitimate heretic? The military stalemate created an agonizing dilemma for Henry: remain true to his Protestant faith and continue the bloody, seemingly endless struggle, or convert to Catholicism and potentially unite a shattered kingdom. The pressure on him was immense, coming from all sides. His loyal Huguenot followers urged him to stand firm, to be the champion of Protestantism in Europe. But many of his moderate Catholic allies, known as the politiques, saw things differently. These were pragmatists who believed that political stability and the well-being of the state trumped religious dogma. They saw Henry's conversion as the only viable path to peace, the only way to end the civil wars and restore order to France. Adding to the pressure was the Pope, Clement VIII, who initially refused to recognize Henry, viewing his past Protestantism and later excommunication as insurmountable obstacles. Without papal recognition, many French Catholics would never truly accept him as their king. The stakes were incredibly high. Continue the war, and France might splinter into independent fiefdoms, vulnerable to foreign powers. Convert, and he might lose the trust of his oldest allies, the Huguenots, but the promise of peace and the prize of Paris beckoned. And so, in one of the most famous and pragmatic decisions in European history, Henry uttered the legendary words, or at least the sentiment attributed to them, "Paris vaut bien une messe." Paris is worth a mass. On July 25, 1593, at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of French kings, Henry of Navarre formally abjured Protestantism and converted to Catholicism. It was a carefully orchestrated public spectacle. Henry arrived dressed in black, accompanied by cardinals, bishops, and a huge crowd. He knelt, confessed his errors, and promised to live and die in the Catholic faith. The bells of Saint-Denis rang out, followed by church bells across Paris, signaling the end of the long siege and the dawn of a new, albeit uncertain, era. This was not necessarily a profound spiritual conversion in the traditional sense. It was, first and foremost, a political calculation. Henry was a realist. He understood that a Protestant king could never truly rule a Catholic France. To end the bloodshed, to unify his kingdom, he had to embrace the majority faith. His personal beliefs, while undoubtedly evolving throughout his life, were secondary to the stability of the state. He famously quipped, "I converted with my lips, but not with my heart." Though this quote's authenticity is debated, it perfectly captures the pragmatic spirit of the act. The immediate reception was mixed. For many war-weary French citizens, it was a moment of immense relief and hope. Peace was finally within reach. The politiques celebrated it as a triumph of statesmanship. However, hardline Catholics remained suspicious, questioning the sincerity of his conversion, and some zealous Protestants felt betrayed. They saw it as a calculated abandonment of his principles. But for Henry, it was the necessary step. This wasn't just a king changing his mind. It was a monarch putting the stability of the state above his personal faith. A radical notion in an age defined by fervent religious dogma. It was a revolutionary act that opened the door for true peace, but only if he could maintain the delicate balance between his newly adopted faith and the needs of his former co-religionists. With his conversion, Henry had won the crown. He was finally crowned King Henry IV, not in Reims, the traditional coronation city, but in Chartres, as Paris was still held by the League. But his entry into Paris a few months later was met with jubilation, not resistance. The city, exhausted by siege and civil war, welcomed its new king. Now the real work began, consolidating his power, winning over his former enemies, and, most crucially, finding a lasting peace for a nation still reeling from decades of conflict. The conversion bought him the throne, but it didn't automatically heal the deep, festering wounds of decades of war. He still had to address the grievances and fears of the Protestant minority, the very people who had fought alongside him for so long. They were a significant part of the population, skilled artisans, merchants, and nobility. Ignoring their rights would simply reignite the civil wars. Henry knew that true peace required more than just his personal conversion. It required a legal framework for coexistence. And so, in 1598, after years of negotiation and careful political maneuvering, Henry IV issued one of the most significant documents in European history, the Edict of Nantes. This wasn't a sudden act. It was the culmination of Henry's pragmatic vision for France. It was a compromise, imperfect, but revolutionary for its time, designed to establish a framework for religious toleration, not true religious freedom as we understand it today, but a significant step towards it. Let's break down its key provisions because they were groundbreaking. First, and most fundamentally, it granted limited toleration for Huguenots. This meant they could believe privately without fear of persecution. Second, it allowed for public worship in designated areas. While not everywhere, it permitted Protestant services in specific towns, usually where Protestant populations were strong. Crucially, it specifically forbade public Protestant worship in Paris and within a 5-league radius around it, a concession to the powerful Catholic sentiment in the capital. Third, Huguenots were granted access to public office and education. This was a huge step, meaning they could hold positions of power, serve in government, and attend universities without being forced to convert. This recognized them as full citizens. Fourth, and perhaps most controversial, it granted Huguenots over 100 fortified towns, known as places de sûreté, or places de refuge. These were military strongholds, garrisoned by Protestant troops, and paid for by the crown. Towns like La Rochelle became bastions of Protestant power. For Henry, this was a necessary guarantee of safety for the Huguenots. For many Catholics, it was an unacceptable state within a state, a perpetual threat to royal authority. Finally, it established special courts, the Chambre de l'Edit, composed of both Catholic and Protestant judges to ensure fair justice for Huguenots, demonstrating an attempt at legal equality. The significance of the Edict of Nantes cannot be overstated. No other major European power at the time had granted such extensive rights to a religious minority. Spain had its Inquisition. England still struggled with Catholic dissent, and the Holy Roman Empire was prone to religious conflict. Henry's edict was a testament to his unique blend of pragmatism and political genius. His goal wasn't necessarily religious pluralism for its own sake, but peace and national unity. He understood that a coerced conversion was no lasting solution, and that only through coexistence could France begin to heal. It was a compromise, a pragmatic solution to an intractable problem, born of necessity rather than fervent idealism. The Edict of Nantes, alongside the Treaty of Vervins signed with Spain in the same year, finally brought an end to over 3 decades of internal and external warfare. France, which had been on the brink of collapse, could finally focus on rebuilding. Henry had skillfully negotiated the treacherous waters of religious fanaticism, offering a path forward where compromise, rather than annihilation, was the guiding principle. It didn't eliminate religious tensions, which simmered beneath the surface, but it created a framework for coexistence, allowing France to begin the long, arduous process of healing and recovery. With peace finally secured, Henry IV, along with his brilliant chief minister, Maximilien de Béthune, Duke of Sully, embarked on an ambitious program of national reconstruction. France, once ravaged by war, began to revive. Sully, an astute administrator, focused on pâturage et labourage sont les deux mamelles de la France. Pasture and tillage are the two breasts that nourish France. Agriculture was revitalized, marshes were drained, and new crops were introduced. Infrastructure was improved with the construction of roads and canals, stimulating trade and economic growth. The French economy, once crippled, began to flourish under this period of stability. Crucially, Henry's reign saw a significant strengthening of the monarchy. By ending the religious wars and asserting his authority over rebellious nobles and factions, he began the process of centralizing royal power. He curbed the independence of the regional parliaments and brought unruly aristocrats to heel. His reign laid much of the groundwork for the absolute monarchy that would reach its zenith under his grandson, Louis XIV. Henry demonstrated that a strong, unifying king could bring order out of chaos, paving the way for France to become the dominant power in Europe. Beyond economics and politics, Henry made genuine efforts at social reconciliation. He visited Huguenot towns, engaged in dialogue with both Catholic and Protestant leaders, and fostered an environment where cooperation was encouraged. He recognized that true peace required more than just laws. It required a change of heart, or at least a change of public behavior. On the international stage, France's resurgence was dramatic. From a weakened, internally divided state, it rapidly re-emerged as a major European power, directly challenging the long-standing dominance of the Habsburg empires of Spain and Austria. Henry's diplomacy and renewed strength allowed France to play a much more assertive role, shifting the balance of power in Europe and setting the stage for future conflicts, like the 30 Years' War, though he himself would not live to see it. His reign marked a critical pivot point in European diplomacy, where the interests of the state, rather than solely religious solidarity, began to gain ascendancy. However, the peace established by the Edict of Nantes was inherently fragile. It was a personal act of Henry IV, based on his will, not a fundamental, immutable change in French law or a deeply ingrained cultural acceptance of religious pluralism. Its survival depended largely on the goodwill and political priorities of future monarchs. And as history often shows, goodwill can be a fleeting thing. Under his son, Louis XIII, and especially his formidable chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, the edict's provisions began to be chipped away. Richelieu saw the Huguenots' fortified towns as a challenge to royal authority, a potential source of rebellion within the kingdom. The siege of La Rochelle in 1627–28, which resulted in the city's fall and the loss of the Huguenots' military and political rights, was a major blow to the edict's spirit. While freedom of worship was nominally maintained for a time, the protective clauses were gone. Then came Louis XIV, Henry IV's grandson, the Sun King, in 1685. Driven by a desire for absolute religious uniformity, the famous motto, Un roi, une foi, une loi, one king, one faith, one law. Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes entirely. This was a catastrophic decision with far-reaching consequences. Huguenots were stripped of all their rights, their churches were destroyed, and they faced brutal persecution through measures like the dragonnades, where soldiers were quartered in Protestant homes with orders to make their lives unbearable until they converted. The revocation led to a massive exodus of hundreds of thousands of Huguenots. Skilled artisans, merchants, doctors, and intellectuals, who fled to Protestant countries like England, the Netherlands, Prussia, and even North America, taking their wealth, skills, and knowledge with them. France suffered an immense economic and intellectual loss, while its rivals gained significantly. It also sowed seeds of resentment and rebellion that would eventually contribute to the French Revolution more than a century later. Henry IV's grand experiment in toleration was undone by the very absolutist tendencies he had helped to foster. Despite this ultimate reversal, Henry IV's legacy as Good King Henry endured. He was beloved by many for his efforts to improve the lives of ordinary people, for bringing peace, and for his genuine concern for the welfare of his subjects. His reign marked a crucial turning point, pulling France back from the precipice of civil war and setting it on a course towards national strength. Tragically, in 1610, Henry IV was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic named François Ravaillac, who believed the king was still secretly favoring Protestants and planning war against the Catholic Habsburgs. It was a bitter irony that the king who had risked so much for religious peace was ultimately murdered for religious reasons, underscoring the deep-seated passions that even his remarkable pragmatism could not entirely extinguish. Henry IV's journey from Protestant warrior to Catholic king was more than a personal transformation. It was a defining moment for France. His religious maneuvering, culminating in the Edict of Nantes, offered a fleeting glimpse of a more tolerant future, a testament to the idea that political unity could transcend religious division, even if that future was ultimately undone by his successors. His legacy remains a testament to the power of pragmatism in an age of fervent belief, and a stark reminder of the long shadow cast by religious conflict and the eternal challenge of balancing faith with the stability of the state. So, what can we take away from the extraordinary reign of Henry IV? We've explored the brutal reality of the French wars of religion, a kingdom on the brink of collapse. We've witnessed Henry's radical choice. Paris is worth a mass, a decision rooted in political necessity that brought him the crown. And we've seen the creation of the Edict of Nantes, a truly revolutionary document that, for a time, provided a legal framework for religious coexistence, making France an outlier in a religiously fractured Europe. We've also traced the edict's eventual undoing and the profound negative consequences of that revocation. Henry IV's story is a powerful reminder of the delicate balance between faith and governance. His pragmatism, his willingness to compromise for the sake of the state, saved France from almost certain disintegration. He understood that unity, even imperfect unity, was essential for national survival and prosperity. But it also highlights the fragility of tolerance when confronted by absolutist ideologies or persistent religious intolerance. It poses a crucial question for any society. Can profound ideological differences be truly reconciled or merely managed? What do you think about Henry IV's monumental decision? Was it a necessary act of statesmanship, a pragmatic sacrifice for the greater good of France? Or was it a betrayal of his original faith, a cynical political maneuver? How do you view the eventual revocation of the Edict of Nantes? Let us know your thoughts and insights in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the fascinating and often brutal history of France and the extraordinary life of King Henry IV, be sure to like this video. Subscribe to History of Anything and Everything for more captivating stories from the past, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical adventure.